Greek accents are one of those topics that seem to really give beginning Greek students and some intermediate Greek students a lot of anxiety. I want to present a lesson here that will try and take some of the anxiety out of accents. I want to assure you that accentuation is not arbitrary. That is, accents can't fall just anywhere, but they fall on very particular places depending on how a word is spelled. All right. I'm not going to get into any of the technical aspects of contonation or mora. You can look these up on your own. But I want to just break it down so that when you're looking at a word, when you're spelling a word, you'll know where the accent ought to go, where it should go based on some pretty simple rules. Now, the rules for accenting nouns and verbs are going to be slightly different, but they do follow some very basic similarities, some rules of the road, so to speak. So let's start with those rules of the road, and then we'll look at nouns and then verbs. So rule number one is that accents can only fall on one of the last three syllables. Right? I should have said accents will always be placed on vowels, but they're only going to be on one of those last three positions. And we're going to have specific terms for this, and it's good to use these terms. So in this word arnumenos, we've got 4 syllables, 4 vowels, 4 syllables, and these last 3 are the only 3 that the accent can fall on. So these are the terms we're going to use for these. The last one is going to be the ultima. The second to the last, we're going to call, is named the penult, the almost last. And then the third from the end is the antepenult, the before the next to the last. So rule number one is that accents can only fall on one of these last 3 syllables, never further towards the front of the word. This alpha could never have an accent because it's the 4th syllable from the end. Now there's a little sub to this, is that if the last syllable of the word, in this case this oo, this diphthong, if the last syllable is long, so may it be an eta or an omega, or it's a diphthong, that is those 2 vowels that are put together, then the accent cannot be on the 3rd syllable from the end. So because this is long here, this alpha could never have the accent. So anthropou, not anthropou. So rule 1, accents can only fall on one of the last 3 unless the last syllable is a diphthong or long, and then it can only be on the last 2. Now you'll notice I put a little asterisk there. There's a little weird rule here that if the final 2 vowels, if that diphthong is actually an oi or an I, that is going to count as short. Okay, so these equal short. So if your word ends in one of these 2, then the accent could fall on the 3rd syllable from the end. All right, but take that rule 1.1 or 1 and 1.1 pretty seriously. That's an important one. Rule number 2 is that there are well, first, there are 3 particular types of accents, and these accents can only fall on certain syllables. So the acute accent, that is the one that looks like this, can be on all 3, right? Any of those last 3 syllables. The circumflex accent, which is either written like this or like a tilde, either way, it depends on the font, that can only be on one of the last 2. And then the grave, which looks like this, points the opposite way of the acute, that can only be on the last 1. And just a little rule about the grave, if the accent is on the final syllable and there is another word that follows, that's when you'll use the grave. Okay, so the grave, last syllable, only when there's another word. right after. Okay, so rule 2 is important. That is, it's not going to be completely arbitrary. You would never find a grave, the third from the end. You would never find a circumflex, the third from the end. So we're sort of narrowing where we can put what kind of accent. Now, rule number 3 is specifically for the circumflex. The circumflex can only fall on a long vowel or a diphthong. So in this word doru, because both of these are long, omicron is long and the omicron upsilon as a diphthong is long, we could put, in theory, the circumflex on either of these. It would fit, and we'd actually put it on the second of the diphthong there. Right? Now this word, it's not arbitrary. You don't have to guess. There is a specific place for this word that this accent would go, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Thing to take away here is that the circumflex can only fall on a long vowel or diphthong. We're going to have a sub-rule to this, rule point 3. So rule 3.1, it can only fall on a long vowel, and it can only fall on the second to the last syllable if the last syllable is short. Okay. Now, this has a lot to do with the concept of mora, which I'm not going to talk about. As I already said, I'm not going to talk about these ideas. You can look it up if you want, if you're interested, but that's what all of these rules about circumflex has to deal with. Why it can only be on a long vowel, and why it can only be on the second to the last if the last vowel is short. So in this sentence, we couldn't put, or in this word, doru, we couldn't put the circumflex on this omega because this is long. All right, so that would be right out. However, in this word, doron, we can put a circumflex over the omega because this omicron is short. Okay? So let's take a look at a couple of specifics. Let's look at nouns and verbs in order. Basic rule for nouns, that the accent on a noun is persistent. It's wherever it begins in a dictionary entry, that's where it wants to stay. That's what we mean by persistent. So when you look a word up in the dictionary, wherever that accent is, that's where it wants to be. It's got a natural position for its accentuation. So for example, in these three words, anthropos, biblion, and theos, these are the dictionary entries. No matter how this word changes, the accent wants to stay here on that third from the end, on that alpha. Biblion, no matter how the word changes, the accent wants to stay there. And theos, the accent wants to stay there. Now there are certain situations it will stay in these positions unless it's forced to change. Right? So the accent on a noun is persistent unless something, its spelling, forces it to change. So let's take a look at this anthropos. So anthropos, this is its natural position, but when it goes into its genitive form, you'll notice the second, or the last syllable becomes long. And you'll remember from rule 1.1 that if the last syllable is long, the accent can only go on the last two. So, or it can't go on the third from the end. So it has to move from the third from the end to the second from the end. That is, it just creeps towards that long syllable. Right, the same thing, that same idea. If something forces it to change, the accent's going to change. So doron, gift, is naturally a circumflex over the omega. But in the genitive, it becomes doru. This is long. And remember, per rule 3.1, we can't have a circumflex on the second to the last syllable if the last syllable is long, so it's going to shift from a circumflex to an acute. Now in all situations, it wants to stay on the same letter, so it can change shape, it can change form from circumflex to acute before it changes position, as it did here. Right? So persistent, it wants to stay in that same place unless the spelling forces it to change. Now for verbs, verbs are a little easier. The accent on a noun, or on a verb, rather, is recessive. That means it's going to go as far back as it possibly can. And you'll remember from Rule 1, an accent can go back 3 syllables to the third syllable. So if nothing prevents it from going back to that third syllable, that's what it's going to do. So for example, in Echoman, we have, this is short, so we can, based on Rule 1.1, we can say, it's not long, therefore it can go back to the third syllable. That's what it's going to do. Echoman. 1, 2, 3. But in Lambanes, look, we've got a diphthong, that's long, and Rule 1.1 tells us if the last syllable is long, we can only go back 2 syllables. That means we're going to put the accent on Lambanes. So the accent on verbs moves around. It's going to try and go back to the third syllable unless the last syllable is long. But the accent on nouns is persistent. It's going to try and stay on that original position.